It is Monday, March 23, 2026, and somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a tanker captain is making a calculation that no mariner in the modern era has had to make. His vessel, fully loaded, drawing nearly 20 meters of draft, is sitting at anchor off the coast of Fujairah, one of roughly 150 ships stranded at the mouth of one of the world's most vital waterways. To his north, the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, the single corridor through which approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply flows. To his south, the open ocean, and a reroute around the Cape of Good Hope that would add 3 weeks and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fuel costs to his journey. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has told him via VHF radio that any vessel attempting to pass will be set ablaze. He has seen the footage of the skylight burning. He has heard about the Indian sailors killed when the MKD Viayam was struck by a drone boat. He sits still. At the same time, in Washington, D.C., President Donald Trump is sitting in front of his Truth Social account. He has already given Iran a 48-hour ultimatum to reopen the strait, and then extended it. And then extended it again. And now, in the pre-dawn hours of a Monday morning, he is composing something that will shake markets around the world before the opening bell. He types, "Iran must open the Strait of Hormuz immediately, or I will order strikes on all of their electrical generating plants, oil wells, Karg Island, and possibly all desalination plants." He posts it. Within 90 minutes, Brent crude swings more than $12 per barrel. S&P 500 futures go red. Across Asia, energy ministries wake their ministers. Here is what the mainstream media is not telling you. This is not simply a diplomatic threat. This is a president issuing a public ultimatum, with specific military targets named, during an active, ongoing war that has already killed more than 2,000 people, partially closed the world's most critical oil choke point, and stranded more oil by volume than any disruption since 1973. The infrastructure Trump named in his post, power plants, desalination facilities, supplies drinking water to tens of millions of civilians across Iran and the Gulf states. International legal scholars are calling the explicit threat to those targets one of the most extraordinary statements ever made by a sitting American president during an armed conflict. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly 3 things. First, how a diplomatic letter sent in March 2025 became a kinetic war by February 2026, and why the outcome was more predictable than governments admitted. Second, what Trump's serial deadline strategy actually signals about U.S. military and diplomatic posture, and what it has revealed about American credibility. And third, what happens to your energy bill, your grocery prices, and the global economy if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, and what the real options are. Stay with me. To understand what just happened, you have to go back to March 7, 2025. On that date, President Trump announced that he had written a personal letter to Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. The letter, according to Emirati political scientist Abdul Khalik Abdullah, included 3 core demands: that Iran fully dismantle its nuclear enrichment program, halt all financial and material support for regional proxy groups, and comply within 60 days. In return, Trump offered to lift the full architecture of U.S. sanctions and normalize diplomatic relations. The message was unambiguous, and it came with an explicit warning: failure to negotiate would result in military strikes. Khamenei did not acknowledge the letter. This was the first miscalculation. In Tehran, the calculation was familiar. American presidents have threatened Iran before. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, had held for years despite tensions. The Trump maximum pressure campaign in his first term had squeezed Iran economically, but had not produced regime capitulation. Iranian hardliners read the 2025 letter as coercive posturing, not a genuine ultimatum. They had survived sanctions. They could survive more. In Washington, the calculation was equally consequential. On April 12, 2025, the first round of U.S.-Iran talks was held in Oman, mediated by Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi, with U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi leading their respective sides. Both governments described the discussions as constructive. A second round was held in Rome on April 19th, a third in Muscat around a week later. Expert-level framework discussions followed. From the outside, the process looked like diplomacy in motion. From the inside, the gap was enormous. Iran was negotiating the scope and pace of any agreement. Washington was negotiating whether Iran would exist as a nuclear threshold state at all. In the weeks that followed, Iran sent a signal that went largely unreported in Western media. From February 15th to 20th, 2025, Iranian authorities tripled their oil export rate and reduced domestic storage inventories to their lowest levels in years. Saudi Arabia began similar precautionary moves. What this told analysts who were watching closely was that someone in Tehran was preparing for a scenario in which the strait might close, and was trying to cash out first. That threshold had now been crossed in the planning rooms long before it crossed in the headlines. The 60-day deadline expired on May 7, 2025. The 6th round of talks, scheduled for June 15th in Oman, was indefinitely suspended. On June 17th, 2 days after the deadline, Trump stated that the United States, of course, supported what came next. Israel struck Iran. Nuclear facilities were damaged. Multiple senior Iranian military figures were killed. Among those injured was Ali Shamkhani, the political advisor who had overseen the negotiation process itself. The diplomatic infrastructure was destroyed at the same time as the physical infrastructure. By the time Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28, 2026, with coordinated U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on Iranian command centers, IRGC headquarters, ballistic missile sites, naval vessels, and air defense systems, the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei among the results, the conflict had been 18 months in the making. The world called it a shock. The data said otherwise. Let us now examine what Operation Epic Fury actually did to the Iranian military, and what it did not do. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper, briefing on March 3rd, reported that at least 17 Iranian naval vessels had been destroyed in the first days of the campaign. He stated that there was not a single Iranian ship underway in the Arabian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, or Gulf of Oman. This was a dramatic degradation of Iran's conventional naval capacity. The Islamic Republic of Iran Navy, the IRIN, and its parallel force, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, had maintained overlapping jurisdictions in the strait for decades. In a 2007 reorganization, the IRGCN was assigned sole responsibility for the Persian Gulf, while the two forces shared the strait itself. That architecture was largely dismantled in 72 hours. And yet, the strait remained closed. Here is something that no military strategist had fully modeled before in modern history. A naval force can be functionally eliminated, and a choke point can still be held. The mechanism is not ships. It is missiles, drones, and mine-laying capacity. Iran's Qatam al-Anbiya military headquarters, its primary command structure for integrated warfare, issued warnings via VHF radio to vessels in the strait beginning within hours of the February 28th strikes. These warnings were not legally binding. Iran did not formally declare a blockade under international maritime law. But ship captains do not wait for legal formalities when they have seen footage of tankers on fire. The weapon system that changed the calculus is the anti-ship ballistic missile. Iran's Khalij Fars, meaning Persian Gulf, is a modified Fateh 110 variant with a range of approximately 300 kilometers, designed specifically to engage large surface vessels. It is maneuverable in its terminal phase, making traditional naval missile defense systems significantly less effective against it than against conventional cruise missiles. The Iranian Sejil intermediate-range ballistic missile, with a range of approximately 2,000 kilometers and a solid fuel propellant that reduces launch preparation time, was used in strikes against Israeli cities and U.S. military installations in Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE. These are not improvised weapons. They represent decades of investment in anti-access, area denial doctrine, the military strategy of making a geographic zone too costly for a superior conventional force to operate in. What this means in practice is that the U.S. Navy, despite its carrier strike groups in the region, is operating in an environment for which no full operational template exists. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group and supporting assets have conducted interdiction operations, but the fundamental problem is geography. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. A carrier group cannot simply hold a choke point that requires continuous presence in close proximity to a missile-equipped adversary. The calculation that military strategists are actually discussing, quietly, is the difference between degrading Iran's capacity to interdict shipping and fully suppressing it. These are not the same operation. What Trump's ultimatum reveals, when read through a military lens, is that the United States has chosen a coercive pressure strategy rather than an operational seizure strategy. On March 19, 2026, U.S. forces launched a campaign specifically aimed at opening the strait by force, striking Iranian anti-ship missile sites, radar installations, and mine-laying assets along the coastline. The operation made material progress. The IRGC's ability to conduct organized naval interdiction was significantly degraded, but the threat of sporadic missile and drone attacks on commercial shipping persists. Insurance underwriters, who have a 72-hour cancellation clause on war risk policies and have already raised premiums to 4 and 5 times pre-war levels, are not going to certify the strait as safe based on a Pentagon briefing. They will wait for sustained, verified traffic. This is where Trump's deadline strategy intersects with the military reality in a way that has created a credibility problem. By issuing a 48-hour ultimatum on March 21st, then extending it by 5 days, then extending it again to April 6th, Trump has demonstrated that the deadlines are negotiating instruments rather than operational triggers. This is a calculated ambiguity, deliberately keeping Iran and markets uncertain about what comes next. The risk is that once a government has moved deadlines 3 times, the 4th deadline carries less weight. And in a conflict where the only tool for reopening the strait without a ground campaign is the credible threat of overwhelming force, reduced credibility is a strategic cost. Watch the strait. Watch the insurance markets. Watch what China does next. This is the section that connects what is happening 7,000 miles away to the price of fuel in your city, the cost of the groceries in your refrigerator, and the interest rate on a loan you might be taking out in the next 6 months. On March 4, 2026, Brent crude closed above $120 per barrel. That was not the ceiling, it was a waypoint. The IRGC spokesperson, in a statement that has since become one of the most financially consequential utterances of the year, said explicitly, "You will not be able to artificially lower the price of oil. Expect oil at $200 per barrel." The IEA, in an emergency session, announced the release of 400 million barrels from member state strategic reserves, a coordinated dump that represents the largest emergency release in the organization's history. Let me put this in concrete terms. The world consumes approximately 105 million barrels of petroleum per day. 400 million barrels is less than 4 days of global consumption. And when compared to the normal daily flow through the Strait of Hormuz, approximately 20 million barrels, it equals 20 days of typical strait traffic. It steadied prices temporarily. It did not solve anything. By late March, Brent crude was trading at approximately $103 per barrel, down from its $120 peak, but up $28 from the day before the war began. For context, Brent was trading at $72 per barrel on the Friday before Operation Epic Fury launched. The $30 plus increase in 5 weeks represents one of the most rapid sustained oil price surges in 40 years. U.S. gasoline prices crossed $4 per gallon, the highest since late 2023. On March 31st, Trump himself acknowledged gas prices while telling reporters that the U.S. would be leaving Iran in maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3, suggesting the domestic economic pain was registering inside the White House. Now let us follow the transmission mechanism downstream, because oil prices are only the beginning. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of globally traded liquefied natural gas, almost entirely from Qatar's North Field, the single largest natural gas deposit on Earth. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all LNG exports when the strait closed. Force majeure is a legal term meaning an unforeseeable event that makes contractual obligations impossible to fulfill. Every long-term LNG contract tied to Qatari supply is now in legal limbo. Europe sources 12 to 14% of its LNG from Qatar. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and India have far higher dependencies. Pakistan sources 99% of its LNG from Qatar and the UAE. Bangladesh sources 72%. The substitution problem is not simply a price problem, it is a physical availability problem. The Atlantic Basin cannot reroute enough supply to replace Hormuz LNG in the time frame that matters. Here is the fertilizer connection that almost no mainstream outlet has fully explained. The Persian Gulf accounts for roughly 30 to 35% of global urea exports and 20 to 30% of global ammonia exports. Up to 30% of internationally traded fertilizers normally transit the Strait of Hormuz. Urea and ammonia are the primary nitrogen-based fertilizers on which global agricultural yields depend. Brazil alone sources nearly half of its fertilizers through Hormuz. Brazil produces approximately 60% of the world's traded soybeans and is a major exporter of corn and sugar. A sustained fertilizer shortage does not hit food prices next week. It hits food prices in the harvest 6 to 9 months from now. The planting season is happening right now with disrupted supply chains. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from a missile warning transmitted over VHF radio in the Persian Gulf to the price of bread in your city 6 months from now. The countries most exposed in the immediate term are well documented. Japan holds approximately 254 days of strategic oil reserves, one of the world's deepest emergency stockpiles. South Korea holds approximately 180 days, but its net oil imports represent 7% of GDP, making it acutely vulnerable to price rather than supply shocks. India's exposure is the most complex. 60% of its oil imports come from the Middle East, and more than half of its LNG imports are Gulf-linked. The U.S. Treasury granted India a temporary 30-day emergency waiver on March 6th to purchase stranded Russian oil cargoes, an extraordinary step that used the financial architecture of the sanctions system as a crisis response tool. China, the world's largest oil importer, purchases roughly 30% of its oil via the strait, with another 10% from Iranian supplies that it had already been absorbing through a shadow fleet that is now itself under pressure. The shipping cost impact extends far beyond oil. Container rates from the Gulf to Europe have increased by more than 60%. Rerouting via the Cape of Good Hope adds 14 to 21 days to journeys that previously passed through Hormuz and the Suez Canal. Every day of additional transit time is a day of inventory not arriving. In manufacturing supply chains where just-in-time inventory is the operating norm, that is not an inconvenience, it is a production shutdown. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed. Now let us examine the diplomatic chessboard, because the public statements and the private incentives in this conflict are operating on entirely different frequencies. Begin with what each party needs to tell its domestic audience. For the Trump administration, the strategic narrative is that America delivered maximum pressure, achieved the elimination of a nuclear threshold adversary's leadership, and is now negotiating from a position of total strength. Trump's public statements, that Iran is begging to make a deal, that he has spoken with representatives of a new and more reasonable regime, are calibrated for that audience. The domestic political imperative is to define this as a victory in progress, not an ongoing war with uncertain resolution. That framing requires Iran to be visibly weakened and visibly negotiating. The problem is that Iranian officials deny negotiations are occurring. On March 23rd, a senior Iranian foreign ministry official told CBS News that Iran had received points from the U.S. through mediators and that they were being reviewed. That is not a denial of contact. It is a careful calibration of what Iran can acknowledge without being seen as capitulating. For Iran's surviving government, which, following the death of Khamenei, is navigating an institutional succession that has no modern precedent, the domestic narrative requires that any ceasefire not look like surrender. Iran's 5 publicly stated conditions for ending the war, released on March 25th, include war reparations, recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, and an end to all aggression across all fronts, including against regional proxy groups. These are not negotiating positions designed to be accepted. They are positions designed to demonstrate, to an Iranian domestic audience that has been bombed, that the government is not yielding on terms dictated by Washington. The mediators are where the real action is. Oman has functioned as the back channel for U.S.-Iran communication for decades. It is the one Gulf state that maintains diplomatic relations with Tehran and is trusted by both sides. But Oman's Muscat has already hosted multiple rounds of talks, and the framework is now under pressure from events on the ground. Turkey has stepped into a more active role. Iranian Foreign Minister Aragchi spoke by phone with Turkish counterpart Hakan Fidan on March 23rd, and Ankara has been explicit about its desire to mediate. Turkey has leverage. It is a NATO member, it has working relationships with both Iran and the United States, and its economy is substantially harmed by 100+ oil. Pakistan is the quieter but potentially more effective intermediary. NPR reported that it was Pakistan that delivered the U.S. ceasefire proposal to Tehran. Pakistan has warm ties with the Trump administration and historical religious and political links to Iran. That the U.S. chose to route a 15-point ceasefire proposal through Islamabad rather than Muscat says something about the current state of the Omani Channel. China has leverage it is not fully using. China receives roughly 30% of its oil through the strait and has the single largest economic stake in a rapid resolution. Beijing's public position has been to call for de-escalation while avoiding explicit condemnation of either side. China's private incentive is more complex. A weakened Iran that remains functional is preferable to a collapsed Iran or an Iran under direct U.S. influence. Beijing is watching, calculating, and maintaining its options. And here's the thing, the headlines aren't telling you. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, are in the most difficult position of all. They are U.S. security partners whose infrastructure has been targeted by Iranian missiles. They hold enormous reserves of oil they cannot export while the strait is closed. They are experiencing food supply emergencies. By mid-March, 70% of the Gulf Cooperation Council's food imports were disrupted, forcing retailers to airlift staples at costs that produced 40 to 120% price spikes in consumer goods. And they cannot publicly pressure Washington to stop a war that Washington launched, in part, to protect them from Iran's nuclear program. There are exactly 3 directions this situation resolves, and you need to understand all of them. The first scenario is a negotiated resolution. This requires Iran to accept a verifiable commitment to never pursue nuclear weapons and to dismantle existing enrichment infrastructure, or accept a framework that functions as an equivalent constraint. In return, the United States would lift sanctions, normalize relations, and cease military operations. Iran would need a domestic narrative that frames this as resistance vindicated rather than surrender. The mechanism for that narrative exists. If a post-Khamenei leadership can position itself as a new government, making a new agreement, it creates some political distance from the terms. The U.S. ceasefire proposal, reportedly a 15-point document, has been acknowledged as received by Tehran. Iran rejected it on March 25th and issued 5 counterconditions. But rejection of a first proposal is not the same as refusal to negotiate. Every sustained diplomatic process involves rejected first proposals. What makes this scenario possible but genuinely difficult is the physical state of Iran. The attacks damaged nuclear facilities and killed senior military figures. The economy was already under maximum pressure sanctions before the war began. A government emerging from that scale of destruction has political cover to make concessions, but it also has a hardened public opinion and a military-industrial complex whose entire institutional identity is built on resistance to external pressure. The pathway is narrow. The second scenario is continued attrition. This is the current trajectory. The United States and Israel continue airstrikes on military targets. Iran continues missile and drone harassment of regional infrastructure. The strait remains functionally closed or operating at dramatically reduced throughput. This scenario costs the global economy approximately $3 billion per day in foregone trade and elevated energy costs, a figure derived from the Dallas Fed's estimate that the Hormuz closure reduces annualized global GDP growth by approximately 2.9 percentage points in the second quarter of 2026. For every week of continued attrition, Japan draws down emergency reserves it will need months to replenish. South Korea's current account deteriorates. India's inflation rises. Pakistan's gas deficit worsens. And in the United States, gasoline prices, already above $4 per gallon, continue to rise in a way that carries direct political costs for an administration that won, in part, on a promise of economic stability. This scenario does not end cleanly. It either transitions into Scenario 1 through exhaustion and negotiation, or it transitions into Scenario 3 through a single miscalculation. The third scenario is what keeps strategic analysts awake at night. It begins with one of the threats already made explicitly, and taken seriously by people who understand what follows from it. If the United States strikes Iranian power plants, the consequences extend immediately to civilian populations in Iran and potentially to the Gulf states, whose own power infrastructure is interconnected. If Iranian retaliatory strikes target desalination plants in Kuwait, Qatar, or the UAE, as Iran has explicitly threatened, you are talking about the removal of drinking water for tens of millions of people in nations that source 99% of their water from desalination. That is not a military escalation. That is a humanitarian emergency of a scale that would force every nation on Earth to respond. The International Red Cross, legal scholars at Harvard and Oxford, and the Center for Civilians in Conflict have all stated that deliberate targeting of civilian water infrastructure constitutes a violation of the laws of armed conflict, specifically the prohibition on collective punishment. The catastrophic escalation scenario does not require either side to intend a humanitarian catastrophe. It requires only one more miscalculated strike, one more overextended threat, one more deadline that someone decides to actually enforce. The Strait of Hormuz that existed before February 28, 2026 is not coming back on its own. What comes after requires a decision that neither side has yet fully made. Let us connect this back to your life specifically and concretely. The fuel in your car. If you live in the United States, you are paying above $4 per gallon for the first time since 2023. That number is a direct function of Brent crude above $100 per barrel, which is a direct function of 20% of the world's oil supply being stranded or rerouted. If the strait stays closed through the second quarter, Dallas Fed modeling projects WTI oil at $98 per barrel in the base case, and that model was constructed before the threat to Saudi and Kuwaiti oil infrastructure was fully priced in. The food on your table, global fertilizer prices are rising. The urea and ammonia that did not ship through Hormuz this spring will not be in the soil this planting season. The harvest shortfall will arrive at grocery stores in late 2026 and into 2027. Brazil's soy and corn exports will be smaller. Your grocery bill will reflect that with a 6 to 9 month lag that makes it invisible right now, but inevitable. The flight you might take this summer, jet fuel prices have, at moments during this crisis, exceeded $200 per barrel in Asian spot markets. Airlines operating on thin margins are not absorbing that cost. Ticket prices are rising, and some routes, particularly within Asia and between Asia and the Gulf, have already been suspended. The interest rate on your next loan, Goldman Sachs has raised the probability of a U.S. recession in the next 12 months to 30%, up from their pre-war baseline. Federal Reserve policymakers who are tracking toward rate cuts are now watching an oil-driven inflation spike that may force them to pause or reverse. Higher rates, held longer because of a waterway 21 miles wide on the other side of the world. Your pension or investment portfolio, the S&P 500 has fallen approximately 3% since the day before the war began, even after a 15% rally on March 23rd when Trump extended his deadline. Markets are pricing in uncertainty, not catastrophe, which means any deterioration in the diplomatic picture has significant further downside built in. Watch the Strait of Hormuz. Watch the insurance markets for the first vessels willing to transit again. Watch the diplomatic signals coming out of Muscat and Islamabad, not the public statements but the logistical signals, when talks are scheduled, when they are cancelled, and by whom. Here's the question that this video cannot answer because no one yet can. What does a post-Khamenei Iran actually want? Khamenei built the institutional architecture of the Islamic Republic around a specific ideology of resistance and nuclear ambiguity. The officials who survive him were shaped by that architecture. But the war, the economic destruction, the deaths of military commanders, these create the conditions for a genuinely different calculation. Whether the people now making decisions in Tehran have the political mandate and the institutional capacity to break from 30 years of strategic doctrine is the question that determines whether Scenario 1 is possible or whether this conflict enters a phase that analysts are not yet willing to name publicly. The answer to that question will shape the price of everything you buy for the next 2 years. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.